Paul Fugate went missing from his Chiricahua National Monument over 40 years ago, and the circumstances surrounding his disappearance remain a mystery to this very day. With little to no evidence indicating what happened to him, it is as if he just disappeared off the face of the earth. This is the story of the only park ranger to vanish while on duty and never be located. And just a quick note before we start today's video, I've heard his name pronounced as Paul Fugate, but also others pronounce it as Paul Fugate. I'm not sure which is which, so for today's video, I'll just be calling him Paul Fugate, but you get the idea. Fugate, same thing. All right, here we go. The Chiricahua Mountains are an inactive volcanic mountain range that span 20 miles wide and 40 miles long. It is known as the Land of Standing Up Rocks by the Chiricahua Apaches, who originally inhabited the area. It is one of several sky islands in southeastern Arizona. Within Chiricahua Mountains is the Chiricahua National Monument. This unit of the National Park Services encompasses 12,000 plus acres of sprawling valleys, breathtaking canyons, and some of the most incredible rock formations in the entirety of the United States. These distinctive formations create a landscape with jagged rocks, spires, hoodoos, and boulders precariously balancing on one another. Visitors flock to the park to experience the natural wonder of the scenery. But in the 1980s, this park became known for something other than its awe-inspiring views: the disappearance of park ranger Paul Fugate. Paul was born in Brooklyn, New York on September 2nd, 1938. When he was younger, his family moved from New York back to their home state of Texas. This is where Paul grew up. From a young age, Paul was a little different. Rather than be out and about with his friends, young Paul spent much of his time in the backyard tending to his plants and caring for his pet crow, which he tamed and trained himself. Pretty impressive. As he matured older, he continued to enjoy the outdoors, loved adventures, collecting antique guns, and partaking in stimulating conversations. Not surprisingly, given his apparent love for nature, he eventually attained a degree in biology and became a naturalist and park ranger for the National Park Service. He was stationed at Chiricahua National Monument in 1980 as a ranger and worked there for nearly 4 years. He knew the area well and by all accounts was very knowledgeable about the park's terrain, animals, and geography. As an avid hiker and botanist, he spent much of his time exploring the region and park and all its surrounding. Paul was not the type of person to just wander out into the woods and get lost or turned around, which is what makes his case so strange. On January 13th, 1980, Mr. Fugate was working at the visitor center with a seasonal staff member. He was trapped inside working on some boring report, something he hated doing on a beautiful Arizona winter day. Earlier that morning, he had made a deal with the other staff member on duty. He would cover the visitor center for her in the morning so that she could go for a walk, and in the afternoon, she could cover the center for him so he could get out. That gave him time to finish his report. The seasonal was more than happy to agree to that deal. Now, around 2 o'clock in the afternoon rolls around, and he told his fellow employee that he was going to go out for his hike. He said he planned to check the trail that led to Fairway Ranch, a newly acquired 400-acre parcel of land that the park had recently acquired. Paul had witnessed strange activity in that area for weeks and wanted to check it out. Fully dressed in his standard green and gray uniform with his badge attached, he told the staff that they should lock up without him if he was not back by closing time at 4:30 p.m. Paul left his radio and keys behind that afternoon, which was not out of the ordinary. According to those he worked with, the seasonal waved goodbye and watched Paul walk out of the visitor center, toward the trail leading off to a Fairway Ranch and into the beautiful afternoon sun. Sadly, that was the last time anybody would see Paul again. When he did not return to his cabin later that evening, another seasonal employee named Diane, who who had been staying with Paul, decided to notify the park superintendent that he had not returned home from work, and it was well into the evening. The superintendent and a couple of other park employees grabbed their flashlights, heading out into the night toward Fairway Ranch, the direction Paul claimed he was going. They yelled and searched for Paul for several hours before they were met with silence. The following day, with concern for Paul now growing exponentially, the Rangers called the Cochise County Sheriff's Office and Paul's wife. A search and rescue team composed of 22 men and women set out in search of Paul. As the search wore on, members of the Bureau of Land Management, U.S. Forest Service, Southern Arizona Search and Rescue, and many civilian volunteers joined in on the search, combing through every inch of the park. Tracking dogs and National Guard helicopters were also brought in to assist, and no sign of Paul was ever discovered. Search efforts continued desperately for 2 weeks, but it was as though he had simply vanished. The National Park Service even offered a $20,000 reward for any information leading to his whereabouts, but nobody came forward. Now, Paul certainly isn't the first park ranger to ever go missing. It has happened to many seasoned and rookie rangers alike. One misstep can land anyone in trouble, but in all other cases, the missing ranger was located or the remains were eventually found. That is not the case for Paul Fugate, who remains the only ranger to never be found. So, what happened to this seasoned ranger and naturalist who thrived in the outdoors and was very familiar with the mountainous terrain of this national monument? Investigators put forth several theories. One prevailing theory is that Paul stumbled across some drug runners or other illegal activity during his hike and was kidnapped and possibly murdered. This theory was pursued heavily by the leading Cochise County investigator. Cochise County shares roughly 80 miles of the border with Mexico, and in the early 1980s, the Chiricahua corridor was beginning to be used more and more by drug runners. It was not uncommon for runners or mules to pass through the outskirts of the park, as much of the backcountry is rarely ever visited by park goers. Several days into the search and subsequent investigations, his wife had hired a clairvoyant. They went to the faraway ranch and ventured into the Riggs house, the home of the family who gave the faraway ranch to the National Park Service. While inside, the clairvoyant had a vision of 2 men standing over a woman's body, and the woman appeared to be drugged and unconscious. She claimed that Paul walked in on this scene and the 2 men subdued him, drugged him, and dumped him somewhere across the Mexican border. Whether he was alive when he was dumped, she could not say. Going along with this theory, searchers also claimed to find marks on the ground near Faraway that indicated a driver spun out of the road at a high rate of speed. Near those marks also appeared to be signs of a fight, right? Drag marks on the ground and scuff marks in the dirt, as well as scattered bags of peanut brittle. The same kind the park superintendent's wife had given to park employees just a few weeks earlier at Christmas time. Did Paul carry it on him as a snack? Nobody could say for sure. This vision, coupled with the marks left behind near Faraway Ranch, seemed to align with a witness report given 5 days after the disappearance. Dick Horton was a volunteer at the park and a retired police officer. Horton reported that he and his wife were out for a ride when they passed a truck heading away from the park with 3 people crammed into the front seat. Now, he believed that the man in the middle seat slumped over between the driver and passenger and was none other than Paul himself. He reportedly did not think much of the incident at the time, but decided it could have been important information given the circumstances. The lead investigator asked Horton if he would be willing to undergo hypnosis to extract more information from him, and Horton agreed. While under, Horton recounted the incident and stated that Paul looked sad and dejected and was not wearing his glasses, which struck Horton as odd. He stated that the pickup he saw was dark green in color with a camper shell on the back end. He even went so far as to describe the clothes the driver and passenger wore that day. Neither the truck nor the drivers were ever located, and no evidence of foul play was ever discovered. Paul's life and marriage were put under a microscope after his disappearance. Reports about problems in his professional and personal life did raise some red flags for investigators. He had always been called eccentric. He had a history of bucking societal norms and going against the grain. He was a known weed smoker and war protester, and he struggled with Park Service's expectations of how he was to act and looked while on the job. He had been written up several times for his refusal to even cut his hair or trim his beard. Dirty hippie. I'm just kidding. One of his first stations with the NPS was at Navajo National Monument. While there, he clashed openly and frequently with the park superintendent, who referred to as Smokey Pig, and openly joked about watching him tumble off a cliff. The superintendent did not care for Paul either, calling him a different breed. Eventually, Paul was transferred to another park. He ended up at the Chiricahua National Monument, while his wife stayed in Tucson to focus on her career. While at Chiricahua, Paul continued ruffling feathers by growing a handlebar mustache, which blatantly violated the NPS grooming standards at the time. Park officials also said he had a negative attitude and accused him of stealing government property. In this instance, the property was hay used to feed his wife's horses. Although he and his wife both claimed it was untrue, Paul was fired after being at Chiricahua for less than a year's time. Not one to go down without a fight, Paul hired an attorney and took the National Park Service to court, and ultimately was reinstated, much to the dismay of the NPS, and given back pay. He may have gotten his job back, but it was common knowledge that Paul was generally unlikely to advance or be hired elsewhere after the incident. Give him a bad time was Paul's family motto, and he had done just that. Investigators also uncovered that Paul and his wife had decided to try having an open marriage. It was well known, even to his wife, that he had several affairs with younger Park Service employees while at Chiricahua. For her part, his wife didn't mind. She just says as long as it was just physical, nothing more. But remember, the young employee, Diane, who reported him missing, it turned out that she was actually one of Paul's lovers and had become impregnated by him. She told his wife that she was shocked at the news because Paul had told her he had gotten a vasectomy. The vasectomy was news to his wife, but they did spend a lot of time apart, so it wasn't impossible. With all this information coming to the surface, one investigator theorized that Paul had simply run away from his problems that had finally become too much for him. A dead-end job, a pregnant lover, and a crumbling marriage. He felt strongly that Paul took this opportunity to get out while he could and move on. Or perhaps he had run off with yet another lover. With these being the two working theories at the time, and no concrete evidence to support either, the case quickly went cold. In the year after Paul's disappearance, there were a few leads that piqued the interest of investigators, and although they never panned out, they remain intriguing. A man by the name of Jerry Burmeister was living in Tucson, Arizona at the time of Paul's disappearance and working at an auto body shop. In the weeks after Paul disappeared, Burmeister moved back to his hometown of Racine, Wisconsin. Upon his return, he attended a party where he bragged to all who would listen that he left Arizona because he had killed a cop or a Border Patrol agent. He didn't know which, and dumped the body where nobody would ever find it. As we know, Paul was neither of those things, but he wore a badge and could have easily been mistaken for a cop or agent. The police department in Racine caught wind of this incident and called the PD in Tucson, asking if there was any missing officers. They said there was not, but the NPS was missing a park ranger. Burmeister, who recounted everything he had said, claiming he was just drunk, agreed to a polygraph test. He failed the polygraph, and while investigators were sure an arrest was imminent, they could not find a connection between Paul and Burmeister. Burmeister was never arrested, and there was still no solid evidence since polygraphs are inadmissible in court. In another interesting twist, Paul's connection to a local cannabis grower named Raymond Peabody sent investigators down another path. The link between Peabody and Paul was much easier to establish. Peabody's girlfriend was a Park Service employee and a good friend of Paul and Diane's. Peabody operated a cannabis farm near Faraway Ranch. He was convicted of growing cannabis but did not show up to his trial. Peabody was eventually located in New York and extradited to Arizona so he could serve his sentence. When he arrived in Arizona, 2 detectives sat down with him and made an offer. If Peabody told them what he knew about the disappearance of Paul, the courts would dismiss the sentence and he would only serve parole. In response, Peabody stated that he was confident he would only serve a small portion of his sentence anyway, so he chose to do his time. Whether he knew something about Paul's disappearance or not is unknown, but investigators agreed it was certainly a shifty response. As far as investigators could tell, there was no clear link between Peabody and Burmeister. They were sure the case would come together if they could find a connection between these 2 men. Maybe they were the 2 men seen in the truck, but the closest they came to making a connection was a statement made by an ex-girlfriend of Peabody's who claimed she had seen Peabody with Burmeister before, but the story could not be validated. It was yet again another dead end. All these leads kept taking investigators down rabbit hole after rabbit hole. Whenever they thought they were getting close to an answer, something would transpire and force them to change course. The twists and turns of the case are so entangled that investigators still have not been able to unravel them after 40 years' time. Over time, people have begun to question other possibilities and continue to speculate. Paul's wife herself is the basis for one speculation that has surfaced over the years. Is it possible that she had something to do with it? Or maybe they worked out a plan together? There are just enough oddities in the case that have made people wonder. For example, it struck people that his wife stayed in Tucson immediately following the report that Paul was missing, finally arriving at the Chiricahua National Monument 4 days later. She claims she was waiting to see if a ransom note came, or better yet, if Paul would show up in Tucson. According to the park superintendent, just 2 weeks after Paul went missing, his wife asked when she would be eligible to receive Paul's benefits. He noted in a memo that, to him, that seemed premature since, at that point, the search and rescue had just wrapped up and the investigation was really just beginning. In her own words, his wife claimed she wasn't making much money at the time and that asking was just something that needed to be asked. Lastly, Paul's wife was never asked to supply an alibi for the time of Paul's disappearance, nor was her residence ever searched. She did live quite a distance from Paul, but in nearly every investigation, the spouse is looked at. Yet somehow, she never was. She did agree to a polygraph test about her knowledge of the events during the investigation, but the results came back inconclusive. But if you're going to cast suspicions on his wife, maybe a little suspicion should be thrown at the Park Service as well. It's no secret that Paul butted heads with several superintendents during his time as a ranger. He disliked many of them, and they disliked him. When they were forced to hire Paul back after he won his case against them, they were not happy about it. In 1981, the head of the Western branch of the NPS reviewed the case and declared Paul fired for going AWOL. With no evidence to indicate he was dead, they were sure he had walked away from his post. This decision was shocking to everyone watching the case. Following his firing, the Park Service demanded his wife return the salary she had paid from Paul's benefits, plus interest. This totaled to around $7,000. The newspaper had a field day, and the NPS received terrible press, but refused to back down. Meanwhile, Paul's wife and Paul's family denied that he would have left and remained confident that something more sinister really happened. After all, Paul loved his job and fought to get it back. Why would he leave? The fact that the initial search for Paul was contained to just the 17-mile radius of the Chiricahua National Monument has also faced some criticism. The search and rescue teams, led by the Park Service, argued that Paul was unlikely to have wandered off park grounds. But what if he had for some reason? Or what if he had been forcibly removed? Why weren't they checking out further? Finally, when Horton was hypnotized, he claimed the passenger in the truck was wearing a green jacket, similar to Paul's uniform jacket. The initial thought was that the passenger stole Paul's coat and put it on. Yeah, that could be true, but what if it wasn't Paul's jacket? In 1986, Paul Fugate was officially declared deceased after a team of investigators thoroughly reviewed the case. It was clear to them that while it wasn't impossible that Paul ran away, it was equally, if not more possible, that he met with a more tragic end. After he was declared deceased and not out on the lam somewhere, his wife finally received his benefits. In 2018, the National Park Service's Investigative Unit, a unit dedicated to investigating cases that occur on park property, had decided to reopen the cold case, hoping that fresh eyes might generate a breakthrough. Now, 42 years later, they have uncovered no new evidence or leads. The reward now stands at $60,000, but so far, even that is not enough to tempt anyone into coming forward with what they know. Paul's wife believes that Paul had stumbled across something he shouldn't have witnessed and was killed for it. But she has some hope that perhaps one day Paul will reappear, alive and well. At the very least, his remains will hopefully one day be located. In the meantime, everyone continues to ask, what happened to Paul Fugate? Was he murdered in a drug deal gone wrong? Did he run away from his problems of a pregnant girlfriend and a dead-end job? Perhaps an animal got him, or he fell into one of the many canyons or crevices in the park. Given his experience as a naturalist and knowledge of the land, that seems less likely, but stranger things have happened. Before I sign off, I'd like to leave you with a report logged in Paul's case file. Some years after Paul disappeared, a gentleman reported being at a bar in Sierra Vista. This gentleman had known Paul and attended a training seminar with him. He stated that he was sitting at the bar having a drink when another patron walked in. This person set his bag on the ground and ordered a drink. Glancing across the bar, the gentleman did a double take because the patron looked remarkably like Paul. The Paul lookalike made eye contact with the gentleman, and after a moment, slowly and deliberately set down his beer, picked up his bag, and left the bar. Not knowing what to do, the gentleman took the cup the patron had drank from, placed it into a plastic bag, and took it to the local sheriff's department where he recounted the incident. Would you believe that after all the years working with the government, there are no fingerprints or DNA on record for Paul Fugate? More importantly, I want to know what you guys think. Be sure to let me know what you think in the comments down below. I would love to hear from all of you. Also, if you're a fan of storytelling of the mysterious and supernatural, be sure to go ahead and subscribe for more content just like this and smack that like button. As always, I love you all, keep an open mind, and I'll catch you guys in the following video.